Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, I would like to talk about how we can work with transparency here with the Enscape materials. So you've probably noticed that in the previous videos, we talked about the albedo, the height map, and the reflections component, considering the generic material. So we have other types of material that we will further explore. And here in the generic one, we actually didn't talk about the transparency component that we can control here underneath. So let's make a quick test here with a material in our scene. Maybe I can create a material for this glass here. So I will here in the SketchUp model zoom in. I can select this material here. So this material here is called wine. And we can change the transparency parameters here in the SketchUp materials. So if we click here in edit and change the opacity, I'll move this window here so we can see, and I'll also zoom in here in our glass object. So if we decrease this opacity, it's actually working, and we can see here that we have the same parameter up here and also in the Enscape material editor, and we can change this value either here or here. But it's important to notice that when the value is set to 100, which is the highest amount that we can choose, the type of the transparency is called cutout. So whenever we move the slider to the left, it changes to another type of transparency called transmittance. So if we keep this value at 100, we can actually use a kind of map to control the transparency. So we are actually creating a kind of mask. So for example, now with this cutout type, if I click here in this folder and choose, for example, the dirt map that we've used, just to try it out, you will see if we zoom in here, that Enscape is trying to create a kind of mask with this map that can be very interesting in certain situations. So we have this variation of transparency along the surface, but for this example is actually not so interesting. So I will basically return to the transmittance option. And now we can once again control the transparency by either changing here the opacity value in the Enscape material editor or here in the SketchUp model. And here it's also important to remove the dirt texture now, so it won't be affecting the material anymore. And to achieve an interesting result for a glass material, it can be important to reduce the opacity. Maybe we can use the lower value, which is 0. And it's very important here to check the refractive index. So when we talk about material refraction, we are basically talking about the distortion that the light suffers when it crosses a certain kind of material like glass, water, or other materials. And there are different refractive indexes that you can find depending on the surface. So here you can see that this 1.5 index is producing a kind of distortion. So the objects that are behind the glass, they are a bit distorted because of this phenomenon. And if we increase this index here, you will notice that the distortion gets even higher. So maybe I'll return to the 1.5 value, which is actually appropriated to the glass material and gives us a more realistic distortion. And we can go on and try out other parameters here. For example, we can check this frosted glass to simulate a frosted glass in a very easy way, just pressing a button, and we actually have an interesting simulation of this kind of material, but it's not the case, so I'll turn it off. We can also work with color here. We can change the color of the glass and try out different colored glass that can give us some interesting results. But I'll also go back to the original parameter here. And I'm actually quite happy with the transparency parameters. But if you take a look at our glass, and especially if we zoom out, we can see that the glass itself is not so noticeable here in our scene. And that's happening because we didn't change the reflections parameter. So to simulate an interesting glass material, we have of course to work with the transparency, but we have to remember to set the reflections parameter. So I will now decrease the roughness value so that I get a more reflective glass, which is something that happens in real world. So maybe I can even use the lowest value, which is 0. And we can also increase the specular value to make the reflections even more intense. And now we can see in a very clear way that the glass is reflecting the objects around. And of course, now we get a much more interesting and photorealistic material. And this material is also much more noticeable now in our scene. And if we zoom out, we can clearly see that we have a glass here. So finally, I'm quite happy with this result. And it's very important to remember that when we work with transparent objects, we have to configure the transparency, but they are also combined with the reflections so that we get a nice result in the end.